Hello, in this video we will discuss survey and scale design and the use of inclusive language as well as how to avoid bias. Inclusive language will apply both to the item and scale design as well as the overall survey. We'll discuss leading questions, Likert scales, and again we will look at the various types of bias. The use of inclusive language is a concept that many individuals will look at purely from a social perspective. So in other words, maybe they prefer in a survey to ask for how someone identifies with their gender versus asking about sex. They may just, gender is commonly used without actually even considering asking about sex. Why would you ask about sex? Well, there's scientific reasons for that. Because let's say it is a study that's in the medical professions where it is exploring something that's biological in nature. Well, then an individual may want to ask about, may be necessary even to ask about sex and not how someone self-identifies, which is gender. There's also practical reasons for asking about, let's say, something like gender, which can be more inclusive. So perhaps a study is not so much about biology, but it's simply about identifying, let's say, the sample, if you're trying to represent the overall population. And if there's a certain percentage of the overall population that is, let's say, self-identifies as something other than male or female, well, then you want to maybe just ask that question so that way you know if your sample is more representative of the overall population. So that's both scientific as well as practical reason. Also, when using inclusive language, if you're asking about something like, let's say, sex, it may seem more socially acceptable to say what sex was assigned to you at birth, because that's more of the, let's say, the more socially acceptable language that's used, using the word assigned. However, that can also be very much not inclusive, because that can be very perhaps offensive, let's say, to people of a religious faith who believe that no, sex is not assigned at birth, but rather sex is something that's created upon conception. So while one might see that word as more inclusive, it actually can be very much not inclusive. So those are some things to consider. Leading questions, what are those? Well, leading questions can basically be items that are designed in such a way where there's a certain assumption of the participant's beliefs. An individual may have a personal agenda, so they ask or design an item that is leading for one reason or another. Maybe it's done intentionally or unintentionally. There may be political or social reasons also for creating leading questions. And it could also be just simply a lack of knowledge of how to create items so they're not leading. So here's an example of what's called an assumption-based leading question. How much do you approve of the president's policies? Well, suppose participants, which there would likely be many, do not approve of the president's policies at all. Well, the way this is designed, how much do you approve? It's making the assumption that to some degree you approve of the president's policies. So it's leading. What is your opinion of the president's policies may be an item that's designed better so that way you avoid that type of leading question, because it's simply asking what is your opinion of the president's policies. It's not suggesting that they approve to some degree or not. An example of what's called a loaded question would be something like we already mentioned, what sex was assigned to you at birth? It's a loaded question because the assumption here is that sex is assigned at birth. So the individual, basically, if they respond to it, it's sort of like assuming that they believe that sex is assigned at birth, yet a very high percentage of those participants may simply not believe that sex is actually something that's assigned, but rather like I already mentioned, occurs upon conception. Another example could be, do you support the such and such a movement? Well, it could very well be that if the movement is political, that if you ask, do you support that movement, that you are not going to respond with, let's say, no, that you don't support it, because you may be considered against something that's very important in society, whether it be racial or gender or sexual orientation or religious or whatever it may be. So the question's kind of loaded because it's people may be more inclined to say that they support it Especially when you have an item that's a yes/no item like this one, do you support? So it's either yes or no. Well, that could be better designed if it was perhaps a scale. So to what degree do you support the movement? And then that could have at least a range. So that would help be less of a loaded question. Also, when you're designing surveys, just overall, you want to consider how inclusive your survey is. Are you focusing too much or too little on the science, or too much or too little on just trying to be more inclusive based on social or political reasons? Because in order to conduct a scientifically oriented survey, you may have to, let's say, sacrifice being inclusive to some degree in order to achieve the answers that you want to find. So if you believe that it's more inclusive to ask about gender, but it's like a medical study or something where you need to know the biological sex of the individual, then if you asked about gender in that example, you would be sacrificing a very important item that's important to the study, and that's the science. So that needs to be considered. Also, do not require responses. That is actually more inclusive, because if, for instance, there is an item where, let's say, it asks what sex were you assigned at birth, and someone doesn't believe that sex is assigned at birth, well then if it's not required, at least they could just simply skip that item. And there's many other examples I could provide for you, but it is just a good habit, particularly with demographic questions, that you would not want to require that. In general, general rule may be never require a response to any of the items in the entire survey. And also avoid slang. Individuals that speak, let's say if the survey is conducted in English, and many individuals speak English as a second language, if slang is used, then they may not understand what that means. And then so what would end up happening is you're actually having a participant-oriented type of bias, where you may exclude a large segment of the population that speaks English as a second language because, one, they may not respond to those items where slang is used, or they may not properly respond, which would result in unreliable data because they do not understand the slang. Likert scales is something interesting for individuals to examine closely when they're designing a survey, because there are many assumptions associated with Likert scales that may not be quite obvious to the untrained eye, meaning that you need to have knowledge of how a scale should be designed in order to, once again, achieve reliable information, help avoid bias. The order of the Likert scale, is it logical, is it scientific? You also want to look at the anchors or the labels, and even the number of values that are on the Likert scale. One example of scale bias is highlighted in yellow, this first example here. You can see that 1 equals unsatisfied, then mostly satisfied, moderately unsatisfied, and then mostly satisfied and satisfied. Well, there's 3 examples of unsatisfied, so the bias is leaning towards unsatisfied, and that's called scale bias, so that's improperly designed. Something that's not logical would be if you had 1 equals satisfied and 5 equals dissatisfied and so on in the middle. Well, that's not logical, because more logically people would think that the higher the value, the more satisfied you are. So that's an opposite order and can create confusion. Also, a scale can be designed where it's not scientific at all. And this may involve very much a trained eye to look for these things. So for example, in this case, it may sound appropriate to have 1 equals satisfied, 2 equals mostly satisfied, 3 equals neither, then mostly satisfied, and 5 equals dissatisfied. However, neither doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the middle. That value could be very deceptive, because imagine if everyone selected neither, well, that would look like they're, halfway at least, like satisfied, or 50% satisfied, or however you might want to look at that. So in this case, that anchor is not appropriate. Perhaps neither should be just not even a value whatsoever. And instead, in that case, the example in the middle might be like the last example I provide, where it's both dissatisfied and satisfied. You'll also notice in this last example that's both logical and scientific. It is logical because we start with the lowest number being dissatisfied. It's also scientific because if someone is dissatisfied, then arguably that should be a score of a 0 and not a 1, because 1 indicates that they're somewhat satisfied. So therefore, if you put a 0, that would equate to if someone is totally dissatisfied, then they would have a 0 score. And then that ranges from moderately dissatisfied to the middle, which would be the number 2 is dissatisfied and satisfied, 3 is moderately satisfied, and then finally 4 is satisfied. And then finally, I added here a comments open-ended item where if someone wanted to comment on this in greater detail, they could actually put something in there, and that can help you sometimes reveal some information that might otherwise not have been revealed. Finally, bias. There are many different types of bias. Here's only a few examples. It is good to become familiar with the various types of bias to avoid those in both your item and scale design as well as administration of a survey. Administration bias is something where the data does not properly reflect the population. We had already discussed that using the example of people that, let's say, speak English as a second language, and if the survey is conducted in let's say the United States, where it's predominantly English speaking, but however there is a very large portion of the population that does not speak English as a second language, well, you would be excluding that part of the population that does not speak English as a second language. So the survey results would not reflect the overall population. Confirmation bias is something where a researcher is looking for something specifically in the results, and so they basically many times will find the answer they're looking for based on, it could be the way they designed the survey, how they analyze the data, and so forth. So the goal being that one should analyze a survey from a scientific perspective and try to avoid one's own personal bias as the scientist. Conformity and face-saving bias are two types of bias where the participant may answer not truthfully, but rather to conform with society based on what's socially acceptable. An example that was previously provided where maybe it's a certain type of group that's popular in society because for social reasons, even though people may disagree with it, they feel compelled to answer an item that, yeah, they support the group because it's socially acceptable. So they're conforming to what's socially acceptable and not answering that item truthfully. And then face-saving bias would be something where maybe they get embarrassed if they answer the item a certain way. So they want to save face, which means face-saving bias, again, they will respond a certain way, but it is not truthful, resulting in unreliable data. Instrumentation bias is how the instrument's actually designed, the item, how it's phrased. There can be double-barreled items where they're actually asking more than one question within the item. They can be also confusing. There can be double negatives. Some items can be asked one way versus another, where you have to reverse score those items. And while some scientists will say reverse scoring is good, others will show, and there is evidence that shows that can be confusing and people will not answer correctly because they just get confused by the item. Interviewer bias, that could be, let's say there's a live interview being conducted for maybe it's a study like a focus group, or maybe it's some other type of qualitative research, and the interviewer asks leading questions. They're looking for something specific, so they lead the participant a certain direction. We also want to look at who is interviewing. Is it the researcher who may have a bias, or is it someone that's an independent interviewer that has no direct connection to the study, no benefit in any sort of way? And then finally, self-selection is where there are certain groups that do not participate because they choose not to, because of maybe they find that the subject matter is inflammatory or not socially acceptable, or it's against their political beliefs or whatever it may be. And so what ends up happening is the survey data becomes extremely biased because of these groups that do not participate. Thank you very much. I hope you learned a lot, and I wish you a great day.